Welcome to the Reloaders Workshop tutorial part 2A. In this video we'll talk about the Batch Editor tab. Now in part 1 of the tutorial we talked about general operation and how to enter data into your database for manufacturers, calibers, firearms, and your various supplies. In part 2 we talked about the Load Data tab and how to enter load data into your database. Now, if you're not familiar with Reloaders Workshop, or if you haven't viewed those tutorials, I'd recommend you go back and view those first before continuing with this video. The Batch Editor tab works very much like the Load Data tab. On the Load Data tab, we have these filters up here that allow us to filter out loads that we're not interested in seeing at the moment. The Batch Editor tab has the same filters group up here with the same options. I can filter by rifle or handgun. I can filter by caliber. Of course, I only have one caliber listed at the moment. I can filter by bullet. If I only want to see batches that use the Hornady 30501 bullet, for example, I can filter the others out, or I can select the 30712 bullet. Now these options that it gives you here only list the, for instance, in the bullets drop down, it only lists the bullets that are actually in a batch. So if you haven't created a batch using a specific bullet yet, it doesn't include it in the filters. There's really no reason to, because if you select that bullet, it would give you a blank screen. So these filters only show you the calibers, bullets, and powders that are actually in use in a batch. Okay, so I can select, for instance, Hodgman Varget powder, or I can select only those batches that use the 4064 powder or the 4895 powder, that kind of thing. The additional actions group is a little different than the load data actions group, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Now the list of batches that it gives you here, it gives you the batch ID, which is generated by the system, the date the batch was loaded, the caliber or cartridge. It also has a test data column here that if that particular batch has test data associated with it, you'll see a check mark there. The number of rounds that were created, the bullet information. Here we have the Hornady 30501 bullet, .308 inches, 168 grain, boat tail, hollow point match. It lists the powder charge used. Here we have 37.1 grains of Hodgman Varget. Then the primer and case that was used. And if the batch was created for a specific firearm, it'll list that firearm here. Now, all of these batches have any firearm listed, and we'll go over why you would create a batch for a particular firearm in just a little bit. Now, like all tabs, the Batch Editor tab has these 4 buttons at the bottom for Add, Edit, View, and Remove, so that you can add, edit, view, or remove batches. I'm going to go ahead and select Add here to add a new batch. Now, the Batch Editor dialog is probably the most complicated one in Reloaders Workshop. And the reason for that is all the data that we've entered in the first 5 tabs, manufacturers, calibers, firearms, supplies, and load data, all culminates into this one activity, and this is where we have been working towards getting to. All that other data is there so that we can create batches of reloaded ammunition. So everything kind of culminates into this one dialog, and it looks a little complicated at first, but it's really quite simple. At the top we have load data information here, and it lists all of the loads that we have in our database, so we can select which load we want to use in order to create the batch. Now we have these same filters up here at the top because this list can get very long. Over time you're going to be entering more and more loads into your database, so you'll end up with quite a few entries in this list. So we have these filters at the top. Now, for example, if I want to create a batch of ammo for 223 Remington, I'll go ahead and select 223 Remington under the caliber drop down, and you'll see it filters out all the other loads for us here. And what we see are the three loads that we created in part 2 of the tutorial series for 223 Remington. They're all very similar. They all use the same bullet. They all use the same IMR 4198 powder, but they use different primers and different cases. For example, this first load here uses the Winchester small rifle primer, and the case is listed as generic. So remember, we created a load so that we can use mixed cases, which we haven't sorted them by manufacturer. So we're just using a generic case manufacturer. The second load here uses a tool ammo small rifle primer with Hornady cases. And the third load here uses Winchester small rifle primers with Hornady cases. So we can use these filters up here at the top in order to filter out all the loads that we're not interested in, so that we can find the load that we're wanting to load for here. I'm going to use this last one here. It uses the 2266 bullet, the IMR 4198 powder, Winchester small rifle primers, and Hornady cases. Okay. Now, when you select a load at the top here, down here under load details, it'll populate this powder charge drop down with all the powder charges that we entered for that particular load on the load data tab. So here we have the 17.4 grains up to 20 grains of powder. Now, if I select, say, 18.2 grains here, you'll see that it changes the muzzle velocity to 2,900 feet per second. If I select 19.1, the muzzle velocity becomes 3,000 feet per second. And it's getting that from the load data for this load. When we entered the charge tests for each of these charges from the Hornady 9th edition manual, we put in these muzzle velocities. So it's showing me the muzzle velocities that it has in the data file for each powder charge. Now, as we add batch tests and things like that, these muzzle velocities will change, and we may get a range of muzzle velocities for each charge weight, and we'll see that here shortly. Okay. So for this load, I'm going to use 18.2 grains of IMR 4198 powder. Now it also lists the cartridge overall length for our cartridges here. We don't have a fill ratio because we didn't have that information when we created the load for the charge for 18.2 grains. But this cartridge overall length here of 2.2 inches, it's getting that from the bullet data that's in the load. Now let's go back and take a look at the bullet data for the Hornady 2266 bullet. Here we have our supplies tab, and we're looking at bullets, and I'll select the 2266 Hornady bullet and take a look at that. And if we look under the cartridge specific data for this bullet for 223 Remington, we've entered a cartridge overall length of 2.2 inches. We don't have the ogive overall length yet for this particular bullet, but for the cartridge overall length we have 2.2 inches. So when we're over here on the batch editor, we add a new batch, and we select that particular load. We see a cartridge overall length of 2.2 inches, and it gets that information from the bullet data, the cartridge specific bullet data for this bullet and for 223 Remington. Okay. So I can find the powder charge that I'm looking for to get a particular muzzle velocity. It gives me the cartridge overall length of 2.2 inches. Now that 2.2 inches is transferred down here to the batch details, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It's also transferred over here to the firearm specific data, and right now I have any firearm selected, so it's just going to go ahead and use the 2.2 inches that the bullet specifies for that particular cartridge. Okay. Now the firearm specific data, what it allows me to do is select a firearm from my firearm database. In this case, the only firearm that I have that's able to use a 223 Remington cartridge is my Smith & Wesson M&P 15, my AR basically. If I go ahead and select that, you'll see the cartridge overall length stays at 2.2 inches. And then the headspace and neck information goes to 0. I don't have headspace or neck information for this yet. and I don't have the ogive overall length for a cartridge. It's using this bullet, it's 2.2 inches, so it just is not available there. Now let's take a look at what information it gets from the firearm when we create a load or create a batch using this particular load for this firearm. I'm going to go back over to the Firearms tab, and I'm going to select my Smith & Wesson M&P 15 rifle. I'll edit that, and you'll see here the usable cartridges are 223 Remington is the primary cartridge. Now this particular rifle is also able to use 5.56 NATO, and that's actually the primary cartridge for this particular rifle. It's chambered for 5.56 NATO, so it's right on the barrel. So what I'm going to do is select 5.56 NATO and hit the Make Primary button, and that becomes the primary cartridge type for this particular firearm. And it's also able to use 223 Remington service rifle, so I'll add that to my cartridge list as well. 5.56 NATO is still the primary, but I can also use these two cartridges as well. So when it lists the firearms on the batch editor dialog, it's only going to list those firearms that have the cartridge that I'm loading for. It's in the load data for that batch under the usable cartridges list here. Now, if I have used my, say, my Hornady overall length gauge and my bullet comparator, and I've actually measured the chamber of this firearm for use with a specific bullet type, what I can do is I can add a bullet to this. And I'm going to select the Hornady 2266 bullet, and it tells me here that the max cartridge overall length for 223 Remington is 2.260 inches. And if you'll remember, 2.2 inches is the manufacturer's recommended cartridge overall length for this particular bullet. But I've measured my chamber on this rifle, and I've determined that 2.255 inches is the cartridge overall length that I want to use for this particular bullet when I make a load for my Smith & Wesson M&P 14 or 15. Okay, so I'll go ahead and add that, and now I see under my bullet specific cartridge specs, using the Hornady 2266 bullet with this rifle, I want to have a cartridge overall length of 2.255 inches. Okay, and I'll update that. Now, when I come back to the Batch Editor tab, and I want to add my batch here, I'll select the load and the powder charge. Now when I select the M&P, the Smith & Wesson M&P 15, you'll see that the cartridge overall length for this particular bullet is 2.255. And that information is also then transferred down here to my batch details. The cartridge overall length for this batch is going to be 2.255. Now I still have a headspace and neck size of 0. And if I go back to the Firearms tab and edit that particular firearm, you'll see here I have headspace and neck information for this particular firearm. Now, once I have a fireform case that I've fired with this particular rifle, I can use my headspace gauge, whether it's RCBS precision micrometer or the Hornady headspace gauge, or whichever gauge that I'm using. I can enter the headspace for that fireform case from the base of the, in this case, from the base of the head of the cartridge up to the datum line on the shoulder of the cartridge or of the case. Okay. I can also enter my neck size. So, for example, if I have if I've measured my headspace to be 1.55 inches and my neck is 0.230, for example. Okay, so I've measured a fireform case for this rifle, and I can enter that information here, and I'll update that. Now when I come back to the batch editor, and I add my batch. Select all my information here. And I select my Smith & Wesson M&P 15, you'll see now that the headspace information has been filled in with the head spacing that I want to use for this specific rifle, and also has the neck size. Now these are starting values here. Typically you'll want to knock the shoulder back a little bit. In this case, since it's a semi-automatic rifle, I want to knock it back anywhere from 3 to 5 thousandths of an inch. My neck size, I also want to size my neck down a little bit, maybe to get the right neck tension. But it gives me the starting values for this particular rifle using this particular cartridge for the headspace, the neck, and also the cartridge overall length. And at some point I'll know what the ogive overall length is for this particular cartridge with that particular cartridge overall length. But for right now, we'll just leave that at 0. Okay. So I select my load up at the top. I select my powder charge here under load details. And if I want to make this batch for a specific firearm, I can select the firearm and get the starting values of the data that I need to create this batch for that particular firearm. So now I'm ready to enter the batch details, really get into the meat of what my batch is going to look like here. Now, the system assigns a batch ID for the batch. It's based on the next batch ID available. We have the load date, and by loading this batch today, I'll just leave that date there. I'm going to create 50 rounds of this particular cartridge. My case trim length is 1.750, which is the case trim length listed under the calibers tab for 223 Remington. My cartridge overall length for this particular firearm is 2.255. If I want to change it, I can go ahead and change it. I don't, have to use the 2.255 that it came up with for that particular firearm, but I'll leave it the way it is for now. I don't know what the ogive overall length is yet for a cartridge of this length, size with this particular bullet. Now my head spacing is 1.550. Now this is just a starting value. This is what the Fireform case head spacing is. So I'm going to knock this down by about 5 thousandths of an inch. So I'm going to change this to 1.545 inches. So when I create this batch, I'm going to use that particular headspace on the cases. Now this row of information here is really there just so I can record what size, how far down I size my neck, what my neck wall thickness is if I want. I don't have to have that value in there. But if I use that value, it'll calculate my neck tension for me. So the bullet diameter is 0.224 inches. I get that from the bullet data. Now some folks will go to the preferences dialog and change their bullet dimension number of decimals to 4. For example, if I actually measure the bullets in here and I find that they're actually 0.2245 inches in diameter, an extra half a thousandth of an inch. You can change the number of decimal places to 4 here and get a little more precise with your bullet diameter and the neck sizing and all the other dimensions for your cartridges. But I'll just go ahead and go with 224 bullet diameter. Now I'm going to set the neck size. 0.230 is probably low. I just kind of picked a number when we entered that 0.230. I'm going to size my neck, say, to 0.245 inches. And if I measure the neck wall on my cases, I may find that they have a neck wall thickness of 0.010. And what that gives me is a negative neck tension. So that's not a good value. I want this neck tension value to be positive. What this tells me here is that there's going to be a 1/1000th of an inch gap between the inner diameter of the neck and the bullet diameter. So I'm going to size my neck down to 0.240 inches. And this tells me with a neck wall thickness of 10 thousandths, I'll have a neck tension of 4 thousandths of an inch. And what that means basically is that the inner diameter of the neck on my cases will be 4/1000 of an inch smaller than the bullet diameter. And that'll give me a 4/1000 of an inch neck tension. In other words, 2/1000 of an inch all the way around the bullet. So that's what I'm going to size my necks to. These particular cases, say I'm using cases that have been fired one time, so I'll put in a 1 here. And that'll change my cartridge cost down at the bottom and my batch cost. Based on the pricing information that I put in for each of these components, the bullet, the powder, primer, and case, it's determined that the cartridge cost will be 53 cents. And to make 50 of those, I entered 50 under my number of rounds loaded, will be $26.48. So not a bad price for 223. Typically, you pay almost $1 a round if you buy them by factory ammo, and or less. I mean, it depends on where you buy them. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add this batch to my list. Now you'll see it's added batch number 23, today's date, and all of the specifics for the components that I used. And down here under firearm, it tells me that I've created this batch specifically for my Smith & Wesson M&P 15. Once the batch is created, I can go back and print a label for that batch with the print button down here on the bottom of the batch editor. So I'll just hit print, and that brings up the label printer dialog. At the top here, you see what the label will look like once it's printed on paper. At the top, it gives you the batch ID, the date loaded. This particular one is specifically for a Smith & Wesson M&P 15 rifle. It's 223 Remington, and we loaded 50 rounds. The bottom part here, or the middle here, shows me the components that I've used in the batch. Here's the Hornady 2266 bullet, 18.2 grains of IMR 4198, Winchester small rifle primer, and the Hornady case. And since I didn't check the full-length sized checkbox on the batch dialog, it says that I just neck size these cases. Then it gives me the specifics of the batch here. The cases were trimmed to 1.750 inches, cartridge overall length of 2.55, the cases were fired one time. The head space was set to 1.545 inches. We don't have the ogive OAL yet. And the necks were sized to 0.24 inches. And then we have some additional information that we can kind of select. In this case, it defaults to a list of test shots, and where I can record the muzzle velocities of each of the shots if I have a chronograph, and I can record the best group information that I achieved when I went out and tested this particular batch. Now, down at the bottom, we can change the format a little bit. First thing you can do is there's 4 different kinds of paper that it will print on. The 8.5 by 11 letter, if you want to print it on regular paper, you can select that. There's also the Avery 5444 paper, and what that does is it's a much smaller piece of paper that will allow you to print up to 2 labels per page. And these are actually have adhesive on the back, so you can peel them off the paper and stick them on your box of ammo, or your if you have the MTM boxes, that sort of thing. You can paste it right on there. The reason I selected these particular Avery labels is because they're removable labels. A lot of the Avery labels are like packing or a address label or something along those lines, where they're designed to stay on there forever, and getting them off is very difficult. But these particular Avery labels are removable. They can be removed easily. So once you stick it on your ammo box, you can get it off of there without leaving a lot of the glue and paper and whatnot on the box. So they're easily removable. So that's why these particular ones have been selected for Reloaded WorkShop. Now the Avery 5453 paper is a little bigger, gives you a little bit bigger label on the, it's still only 2 labels per page, but you can, add the test shot information or load test data, things like that. The Avery 6482 is an 8.5 inch by 11 paper, but it's colored. It comes in like green and blue and red, I think it is. So for this paper, it doesn't fill in the blue background on the top of the label here, since the label is already colored. And then the 8.5 by 11 paper. Both the 8.5 by 11 paper allows you to put 6 labels per page. Same thing with the 6482. It's an 8.5 by 11 sheet of labels, so you can get 6 on a page. The other 2 are just 2 per page. Now, over on the right here, you'll see that you can select a starting position on the paper. Typically, if it's a blank sheet of paper, you'll start with position number 1. But if you've already printed 2 labels on that paper and you want to print more labels on the same sheet of paper, so you're not wasting paper, what you can do is tell it to start at position 3 here, because positions 1 and 2 already have a label printed on them. So you can put the paper back in the printer and print more labels on the same sheet. Same thing for the smaller labels, where you only get 2. If you've already printed a label on the top portion of the sheet, you can tell it that I want to print this label on the second label. You can put that sheet of labels back in the printer and tell it to start printing on position number 2 here. Now, you can also tell it how many labels you want. Now, this is per batch. So if I want to print 2 labels for this particular batch, I can change the number of labels to 2. I'll just leave that at number 1. Then we have the options for what we want to print at the bottom. If I don't select anything, it just puts the word notes here, and you can use it to write whatever you want about that particular batch when you're out at the range. If I select test shot blanks, it'll put in the blanks here where I can record muzzle velocities and my best group information. If I select load test data, it'll show me all of the test data that I have for this particular charge with this load. For instance, for 18.2 grains of IMR 4198, the test data that I entered from the Hornady 9th edition tells me that I should get about 2,900 feet per second for this. Of course, the Hornady 9th edition for this particular load uses a 26-inch barrel. So if you're using an AR, for example, with a 16-inch barrel, you'll get significantly lower muzzle velocity than the listed 2,900 feet per second here. So it kind of depends on what firearm the factory used to test the load and the firearm that you're using to test the load. So there's also a grayed out area here where you can have it print the batch test data. Now, since we haven't entered any batch test data for this particular load or this particular batch, that's grayed out, so since there's no data to be had for that. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can go about entering batches into Reloader's Workshop. One way is that you can create the batch of ammo, go to your shop and load up the cartridges, and then come back and enter the batch information and record everything that you did with that batch. The way I do it is I'll create the batch first in Reloader's Workshop, and then I'll come here and I'll print the batch label, maybe on a plain sheet of paper, and I can use that then as a recipe for that particular batch. I'll take that label and I'll go to my shop and size the cases and set the head spacing and the cartridge overall length and everything the way it has listed here on the batch label. So I can use it as a recipe. For me, it makes it a lot easier. I have everything right in front of me. Everything I need to do to the cases and for seating the bullet and what components to use and that sort of thing, when I'm in my shop. So it's kind of up to you. If you've already created batches of ammunition, of course, you'll have to go back and enter those batches into Reloaded's workshop if you want to keep track of test data for them. But on new batches that you create, I kind of like to put the batch information into Reloaded's workshop first, and then use the label as a recipe. Okay. So we've entered our batch into Reloaded's workshop. We print a label. We take our reloaded ammo out to the range. When we come back, we can enter the test data for our batch. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Edit for that batch. And there's a test data button right here in the middle. And that'll bring up the batch test dialog. Now at the top we have, batch 23, the date loaded, the firearm type, caliber, load, so on and so forth, all the information about the batch. Down here then we have our test data. We have the date, the test date, whatever date we fired the ammo. The firearm defaults, of course, to the firearm that we created the batch for, and it fills in the barrel length and the twist rate for that firearm. In this case, my M&P 15 AR. The location is optional, but I'll put in Strickland gun range. Then we're going to put in a number of shots we took to get the test. Now, the batch test only takes a single test. Essentially, it's your best group, basically. If you fired multiple tests, for instance, if you do 2 or 3 5-shot groups to test the batch, what you can do is average the group sizes and average the muzzle velocities, that sort of thing. But essentially, you can only enter 1 batch test per batch. So I'm going to put in 5 for the number of shots that we took. And let's say we got a group of 1.65 inches at 100 yards. Okay. Now, you also have a spot where you can check the favorite or reject load. If you really like the load, you can hit the favorite, or if it's a load you never want to make again, you can hit reject here. You can also enter some notes about how things went at the range with that particular load and so on. Over on the right here, we have our shot data, and you can leave that blank if you want. For instance, if you don't have a chronograph and you haven't been recording muzzle velocities, and all you really want to do is record the best group size in the range, you can do that. Otherwise, you can hit the shot data button, and that'll bring up the test shot dialog. And what it wants is the muzzle velocity for each of the shots that you took. So let's say first shot was 2,500 feet per second. If you happen to have a barrel that can measure the pressure, then you can put in the pressure as well. Also, if you had a misfire or a squib load, you can indicate that here, so that the 0 muzzle velocity that you got out of it won't be used to average the muzzle velocity and standard deviation and things like that. And as we enter each shot here, you'll see down at the bottom it calculates the statistics. The average muzzle velocity, the minimum maximum muzzle velocities, the maximum deviation, and the standard deviation. Of course, I only have 1 shot here, so these are 0. Let's put in some more. Maybe the second shot was 2,450 feet per second. 2,506. I'm just kind of picking numbers out of the hat here. 20 and 2,490. So there's our 5 shots. And you'll see the statistics down here are calculated as you enter the muzzle velocities. Here we have an average muzzle velocity of 2,493.2, the minimum 2,450, the maximum 2,520. The maximum deviation between the minimum and maximum is 70 feet per second. And the standard deviation is 23.68, which is a little high. So I'll update that. And you'll see it'll record the shot data over here in the shot data list, along with muzzle velocities, pressures, misfires, and squibs. Okay, and I'll add that test data. Now, once I've added test data to the batch, I can't modify the batch anymore. If I come over here, for example, and I try to change the trim length, the cartridge overall length, things like that, it won't allow me to change anything. So, and also, you'll notice the powder charge, only powder charge list now is 18.2. So, once batch test data has been entered for a batch, you can't modify that batch. You'd have to go in and delete the test data for it. Now also you'll notice here under the load details, the muzzle velocity listed is 2493 to 2900 feet per second. That's because we now have a batch test that shows us that the muzzle velocity that we're getting from this batch, or from this load of ammunition, is 2493. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, close this, and you'll see now too that it's added a check mark for batch number 23 to indicate that we now have test data for this batch. Okay, and that's all there is to adding test data for a batch. Now, one thing that it does, we come over here to the load data tab. Remember from part 2 of the tutorial, charge weights listed in bold have been used in one or more batches on the load data list. And you'll notice here that for the load that we used for that batch, the 18.2 charge is now highlighted in bold to let us know that this particular charge weight has been used in a batch. And if I come in and try to edit the load, it tells me that this load's been used in one batch and cannot be edited. So once I use the load in a batch, can't edit it. I also, if I select the 18.2 charge weight here, you'll notice that remove charge is disabled. I can't remove that charge weight because that charge weight was used in a batch. If I attempt to edit that charge weight, it tells me that this powder weight for this load has been used in one batch and may not be changed. The fill ratio, favorite, and reject selections may be changed. So you'll see here that the powder weight is disabled. I can't change that at all. But I can come over here and change the fill ratio. I can select it as a favorite load or reject it. Excuse me. And you also notice down here under the test data for this batch, or for this charge weight on this load, we see we have a new line of test data. Batch number 23 testing. The barrel length of 16 inches, 1 1/8-inch twist, which is the information from our M&P 15 firearm. We have the average muzzle velocity listed here, 2493. Zero pressure, our best group is 1.65 inches at 100 yards. Okay, so as I enter batch test information for this particular load and this particular powder weight, it'll add that test data to the charge weights test list. Okay. Now while we're here on the load data tab, if you remember back in part 2 of the tutorial, I promised you I'd get back to this evaluate button. Well, now we have everything we need in order to use that button. I've basically turned off all my filters here, so I see all my loads, and all the loads are checked at the moment. And as long as the load, we have at least 2 loads with test data checked, the evaluate button will turn on. Now, if I hit evaluate now, what it'll do is show me all the loads that have batch test data associated with them. You can see I have five loads here with batch test data. And basically it shows me the caliber, the bullet, the powder, primer, and case, and the charge weight used in that particular batch. Now over here at the end on the right hand side of the list, I have the test results, the best group range, the minute of angle of that group, the range that the group was fired at, the muzzle velocity, maximum deviation, and standard deviation of the muzzle velocities in the test shots. So what I can do here is I can say sort on the best group column here from lowest to highest, and I can find out which load is giving me the best group sizes. I can also sort by muzzle velocities and see which loads are giving me a particular muzzle velocity in case I'm trying to achieve a particular muzzle velocity for a particular bullet. I can also evaluate my loading techniques here with maximum deviation and standard deviation to see which loads, I have better powder weight consistency, and I'm getting the closest or the least deviation from shot to shot in my muzzle velocity. So I have a few things that I can do with evaluating my loads. I have filters up at the top here. For example, I can filter out everything except 308 Winchester tests. I can also filter out, say, everything except loads that use the 30-31 bullet, that sort of thing. So uh, I can filter out what data I don't want to see, and then I can evaluate just those items that are similar. So I know that I'm comparing apples to apples. Now this include factory test data. I can go ahead and include that, but basically what it's going to do is give me all the test data that I typed in from, say, the Hornady 9th edition manual here, in addition to the batch test data, which we mixed in there with the others. So obviously with the data that I type in from the books, I don't have any group sizes, but I can compare muzzle velocities, say for my 308 Winchester using a 30-31 bullet. I can look at my muzzle velocities and see the difference between my velocities and the velocities that are listed in the book, that sort of thing. So it allows me to evaluate the factory test data as well. But in most cases, you're going to be looking at the group sizes and seeing which load is most accurate. And you want to leave the factory test data out of that since there are no group sizes. Now let's go back over to the Batch Editor tab and talk about these additional actions that you can do on batches. The two buttons on the left here, Archive Checked and Unarchived Checked, allow you to archive and unarchive batches. Over time, this list of batches is going to get huge. The more batches you create, it just adds more and more batches to this list. And even using the filters, uh, it's still going to show old batches that you maybe did last year or something like that, and you're not really interested in seeing those anymore because you're not working with those batches anymore. So what you can do here, I have this Show Archive Batches checkbox here. If I check that, you'll see a couple batches pop up on my list here, batches 2 and 3. And after the batch ID, it says archived. So these two batches are archived. If I turn off the Show Archive Batches, they disappear again. Now, as I finish the testing for a batch and I'm not working with that batch anymore, or if it's an old batch, what I can do is I can check batches that I want to archive. And as long as one or more batches are checked, the Archive Checked button will activate. And I can hit the Archive Checked button here, and you'll see that the checked batches have disappeared from the list. If I show Archive Batches again, they pop back up. And they're still checked. So if I want to unarchive these and put them back on my list, I can simply hit the Unarchive Check button, and you'll see the archive flag is removed. So, and then when I turn off Show Archive Batches, they remain on the list. I can uncheck them here. Okay, so it's very easy to archive a batch. The batch is still there. The batch test data will still show up on the Load Data tab or on the charge test list for specific charges and the loads that they use. It'll show up on the load evaluation, so you can evaluate loads that, even though they're in an archive batch, it'll still allow you to evaluate those loads. Okay, so archive and unarchived checked, and the ability to show archive batches or hide archive batches. Very simple to use, and it really helps to clean up your list as you uh, are finished with the batch and you're not doing anything with it again. Simply archive it. It'll disappear from the list and make it so that your batch list only has those batches that you're currently working with. Now the other button on the additional actions group here is print checked batch labels. Now we went through how to print a batch label, but we're printing one at a time. So what I'd have to do is go into a batch, edit it, hit the print button, print this batch label, put the paper back in the printer, pick the next batch, hit the print button, select the starting location on the paper, print that batch. That can take a while, especially if you've got a lot of batches to print. If you created maybe 5 or 6 batches all at once, and you want to be able to print labels for them all at once. Well, what you can do is select a number of batches that you want to create labels for, just by checking the check boxes, and hit the print checked batch labels box. And here the title is print checked batch labels, and it tells me that I'm going to be printing 5 labels. The sample label that it shows me here is the first label in the list that's checked. In this case, it's batch number 12. And it shows me all the data, and I can decide how I want to print it, what I want it to look like, that sort of thing, the kind of paper. If I want to start on in position 1 on the paper, I can do that. And then when I hit print, it'll print a label for all of those batches. It'll print the first one in area 1, the second one in area 2, third in area 3, and so on until all of the labels have been printed for all of the checked batches. Now I can also tell it I want to print 2 labels per batch. So if I have, in this case, I have 5 batches checked, it'll print 2 labels for each of those batches for a total of 10 labels. So it makes it a lot easier to print multiple labels or labels for multiple batches all at once, rather than having to keep printing a single batch, put the paper back in, print the next batch, and so on. Makes it a lot easier to print multiple labels. And that's really all there is to the batch tab. The biggest thing you'll need to get used to is the batch dialog. It looks very busy, it looks very complicated, but if you break it down into its component parts, where you're selecting a load, you're selecting a charge, selecting a firearm, and adding the batch details. It's a lot simpler to think of it in those terms. Just break it down into into 4 different sections there. That's all for this video. I hope you liked it. If so, please click the like button. Maybe even subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and happy reloading.